So throughout the day, we have been taking and collecting all of the questions that you've submitted on Slido, as Bridget answered. So I am literally just going to be reading questions and then reading answers to you guys to get kind of the most highly voted questions just knocked off the list, so that way everybody has some answers right now. So just bear with me. It's going to be a lot of looking at my computer screen. I apologize for that. Okay, so I already answered the question that I think was the most highly rated. Just to clarify that on the FIM, that CMS again is not requiring anybody to collect data on that. That question actually, as we were looking through the Slido questions, came up several more times. So we do just want to reiterate again that as of October 1st, CMS will no longer be requiring facilities to submit FIM data, and whether or not a facility wants to continue to collect data on that is completely up to them. All right, so my next question is also about the FIM. Will Medicare consider FIM information during an audit or denial of a claim to prove medical necessity? So our answer for that, anything in the medical record can be used to prove medical necessity. My next question, how many hours upon admission is allowed before the identification of the pressure ulcer is still considered present upon admission? Clinical assessments of patients in the IRF should be completed according to accepted clinical practice and comply with facility policy and state and federal regulations. The general standard of practice for newly admitted patients is that clinical admission assessments are completed beginning as close to the actual time of admission as possible, and usually within 24 hours. For example, if a facility requires that a full patient assessment be completed within the first 24 hours, then the information required in the IRF-PAI admission assessment would be coded based on that assessment. My next question is, what is being accomplished with dropping the FIM? Its value is supported by research. The SNF tool doesn't measure change as well. Measurement of function is a great advance in rehabilitation. It should be done across the medical spectrum. Are we backsliding by selecting a less precise measurement tool? Essentially, we're removing the FIM to reduce regulatory burden on you guys. Current IRF performance of the DRR measure is already well above 90%, with some IRFs coding incorrect values for the discharge item due to confusion with the verbiage used. While this is an important clinical topic, at what point will the measure be considered topped out or not a meaningful measure? I'd just like to respond with CMS is continually monitoring the performance of the measures in relation to the meaningful measures framework and will continue to do so. All right, my next question, what happens if in your facility the RN notifies the MD for any issue, even if not significant? Does the PPS coordinator use their judgment to determine if it's significant or not? So we would reply, a clinician needs to make the decision as to whether the call to the physician relates to a clinically significant medication issue. Individual facilities may have their own policies regarding who can determine what is clinically significant. In that case, please follow your facility protocols. My next question says, asking an RN to use clinical judgment as to ineffective drug therapy is out of scope for nursing practice. How do you determine this at the time of admission? How do you know if it's ineffective on admission? So CMS does not provide guidance on who can or who cannot code the DRR items. We ask that you refer to your facility, federal, or state policies and procedures to determine which IRF staff members may complete a DRR. Data in the IRF-PAI should be consistent with information reported in the patient's medical record. The necessary information needed and used to code the items should be recorded in the patient's medical record. Each facility determines their policies and procedures for completing the assessments, and each facility provides patient care according to their unique characteristics and standards, for example, their patient population. My next question is, what is the reason for suppressing the public reporting of the preventable readmission measures, both the within stay and the 30-day post-discharge? So for that one, CMS needed additional time to allow for more testing to determine if modifications to the measures and methods of display were needed. This additional testing will ensure that the future publicly reported measures will be thoroughly evaluated, so compare users have an accurate picture of provider quality. My next question is, if a patient is admitted and we assess the pressure ulcer as a stage 3, but was a stage 4 at a previous setting, the physician documents on the history and physical as a stage 3. what ICD-10 code goes on the IRF-PAI, the code for stage 3 or the code for stage 4? And our response is the pressure ulcer should be coded as a healing stage 4, both for section M and item 24. Let me see. While the pressure ulcer and injury items are clinically useful, the changes in skin integrity measure identifies less than 2% of Medicare cases. This provides little opportunity for improvement for IRFs, and with little or no changes over the last 3 years, brings into question if this meets meaningful measure criteria. So again, we'd like to reply that CMS is continuously monitoring the performance of the measures in relation to the meaningful measures framework, and will continue to do that. When a patient arrives with a non-removable dressing or device with no documentation from the previous facility of a pressure ulcer or pressure injury, the IRF has no way of assessing for a pressure ulcer or pressure injury. If this device is removed during the IRF stay and the pressure ulcer pressure injury is identified, this negatively impacts the IRF. How can we address this? So our response to that is you must document that there's a pressure ulcer injury under the non-removable dressing to code it in section M on it. You must have documented that there is a pressure ulcer under the non-removable dressing to code it in section M on admission. My next question is in relation to the DRR. Please provide examples of ineffective drug therapy and non-adherence, both purposeful and accidental. So our response to that is that these assessments should be completed by licensed clinicians within their scope of practice, and best clinical judgment should always be used. The intent of the DRR is to identify, address, and prevent and or mitigate harm to the patient. So we really want to kind of encourage that that's the purpose of the measure. And CMS, we just want to encourage that clinical judgment should always be used. The next question is, please give more examples of clinically significant issues. This measure referring to the DRR discourages documenting issues. Midnight of the next. I'm going to come back to that question, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Please give more examples of clinically significant issues. The DRR measure discourages documenting issues. Midnight of the next calendar day seems arbitrary and not that urgent if the provider has such a long time to respond. And our response to that is that best clinical practice would be to act upon any significant medication issue promptly. CMS had to put a time parameter on this item, and based on feedback and discussions, that was the time parameter that was finalized. Since the inception of the quality reporting measures in the quality reporting program in 2016, this system has taken a backseat to the FIM. However, that is the data that is being used to calculate the case mix groups for the IRF-PAI 3.0. At some point in the future, will the CMGs be recalculated based on more reliable data when the QRP system is primary? And again, our response to that is that CMS is continuously monitoring the data, and that will continue to propose updates to the payment system as appropriate through rulemaking. The verbiage of the N2005 item and responses are causing issues with the IRF performance on the DRR measure. Would CMS consider revising the verbiage so that the no response indicates that additional issues were not found since admission and that the appropriate follow-up actions were not completed? So to that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your feedback. CMS is always open to stakeholder feedback, and we take all feedback under consideration, so we will definitely take this back with us. My next question says that if a patient was already on oxygen and the nurse contacted the physician for an order for a higher flow rate due to desaturation, is this considered a DRR issue? For this one, I really have to say that this is a clinical judgment based on the specific circumstances on the situation. To really accurately answer this question, I would need more information. So if the person that asked this question wanted to come follow up with me, I'd be happy to speak with them. But this is really a clinical judgment based on the specific circumstances of that situation. My next question is, why don't you include urinary incontinence and high BMI in the risk adjustment for pressure ulcer injury? And for this, we have done data analysis that's shown that a higher BMI and urinary incontinence do not have a high correlation for pressure ulcer risk and injury. So that's why that's not involved in that risk adjustment. What happens if a DRR problem is identified on day 9 and the physician is notified and action happens appropriately within the required time frame, but the problem should have been identified on day 2, but it wasn't? Do we dig that deep, or do we score based on the day that the problem was identified? So this is another little bit of a tough one, but the clinician should use clinical judgment to determine if the potential or actual issue would rise to the level of clinical significance that would require two-way communication with the physician and completion of a prescribed or recommended actions by midnight of the next calendar day at the latest. We would really ask that clinicians refer to their facility and state policies and procedures for resolving potential or actual clinically significant medication issues when there's a discrepancy in documentation, or if there's disagreement among team members regarding whether or not a scenario is a potential or clinically significant medication issue. Would instances such as a patient whose pain wasn't sufficiently controlled during therapies, or someone who received sleep meds was unable to sufficiently rouse the next morning, with communication of patient response to the provider, generally be considered as clinically significant? This question is truly clinical judgment. You'd have to use your clinical judgment as to whether or not your patient not rousing due to medicines issued is clinically significant or not. So that would be very much so based on this scenario and your patient's current condition. Is there effort to close the interpretation gap with the section N as to what is considered clinically significant? I understand CMS states it is based in clinical judgment, but as a clinician, it is unclear what should be reported. Can CMS provide examples based in submitted? Can CMS provide published examples based in submitted scenario questions? This, again, in section N, what is considered clinically significant is truly clinical judgment. So yeah, we would defer to clinical judgment on that. So yeah, clinical judgment, apologies. To prevent incorrect coding of N2005, are there any plans to update the technical specifications to not allow the use of code 1 or code 9 in N2005, only allowing a code 0 if N2003 equals 0? No. This is another where I'd like to thank you for your feedback in submitting this. We will absolutely take this feedback into consideration as we move forward. I have another question on section N. Is there effort to close the gap within section N as facilities vary in what is considered clinically significant medication issues? CMS has stated the use of clinical judgment to determine what meets the definition. This person stated that they are a clinician and they have difficulty differentiating what that means in terms of reporting. And again, we truly have to say use your clinical judgment in conjunction with your facility and state guidelines. CMS does not necessarily, we're not able to prescribe for every single situation just because humans are humans, we are so complex, and if we got to the point where we were prescribing for every single scenario, it would never end. So we're really trusting everybody as licensed providers, as licensed clinicians, that they have the clinical judgment to make these calls. And then the last question that I have an answer, actually I have a couple more, 2 more questions. So my next one is, I was under the understanding from the IMPACT Act that a pharmacist must conduct the admission drug regimen review. Your comment was that it could be made by any clinician. Can you please clarify? So again, with this, CMS actually does not provide guidance on who can or who cannot code the DRR items. We ask that you refer to your facility's state and federal policies and procedures to determine which IRF staff members may complete a DRR. Data in the IRF-PAI should be consistent with information reported in the patient's medical record. The necessary information needed and used to code the items should be recorded in the patient's medical records. Each facility determines their policies and procedures for completing the assessments. Each facility provides patient care according to their unique characteristics and standards or patient populations. And then the last question that I have an answer prepared for you. Regarding the DRR, what would be the appropriate responses for N2003 if the physician does not carry out the recommendations? For example, if the physician's judgment is to not make the recommended changes at the particular time or instance. So for N2003 medication follow-up and N2005 medication intervention, both would be coded as 1 yes. In this scenario, if the following occurred: 1, at admission and at any time throughout the patient's stay, the clinicians contacted the physician or physician designee regarding all identified potential or actual clinically significant medication issues. And 2, the physician or physician designee communicated to the clinicians that no actions were necessary regarding the reported issues. And 3, all communications took place by midnight of the next calendar day. So that is the last question that I have. Thank you so much for taking the time to submit your questions, and we will definitely have some more answers for you tomorrow, the next Q&A session. Well, thank you.